Imagine you wake up tomorrow morning, right? You grab your coffee, head out to the ATM to get some cash for the weekend.
Standard Saturday morning.
Exactly. Put your card in, and the screen just blinks red. Out of service. Annoying, but, whatever. You go to the corner store and try to buy your coffee with Apple Pay.
Let me guess. Declined.
Decline. So you try your physical credit card, also declined. Then you call your boss, and they tell you, payroll didn't clear last night. In fact, no transactions are clearing anywhere.
Yeah, that is a total nightmare scenario.
Right. The entire financial circulatory system of the country it's just stopped pumping.
Completely seized up.
But the crazy thing is, if we were living in the 1800s, this wouldn't be the plot of some, dystopian thriller. It would just be a regular Tuesday.
Oh, absolutely. Financial panics, bank runs, total systemic collapses, those were just the cost of doing business back then.
It's wild to think about.
Yeah.
And the only thing standing between our highly complex modern economy and that exact apocalyptic scenario today is this invisible, highly engineered mechanism.
Right. It is essentially the ultimate background operating system. I mean, we interact with it every single day, completely oblivious to the fact that it's there.
Yeah, just quietly humming away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Quietly preventing the entire machinery of modern society from catching fire and burning to the ground.
And that invisible infrastructure is the central bank. So today, we are taking a massive deep dive into the evolution of central banking.
Both globally and specifically looking at the Reserve Bank of India, right? The RBI.
Yes, exactly. We're basing this deep dive entirely on a really dense, comprehensive text. It's chapter 1 from our source material, titled Evolution of Central Banking Globally and in India.
It's a heavy chapter.
It is. And normally, institutional history like this can feel like a brick wall of dates and financial jargon.
Oh, for sure. It puts people right to sleep.
But not today. Because our mission for this deep dive is to basically act as your personal academic researchers and instructional designers. We know you're probably prepping for a major exam or a high-stakes meeting.
So we are going to completely deconstruct this chapter for you.
Right. We aren't just going to have a standard conversation. We are going to build a mental infographic together. A highly detailed 7-part text-based blueprint.
And the promise here is that if you master this audio blueprint, you will never need to reread that chapter again.
Never. We're going to look under the hood and figure out exactly how and why these financial mechanisms work.
And we should clarify, we are going to approach this objectively.
Yeah, very important point.
We aren't here to debate the politics of monetary policy or, take sides on regulatory decisions mentioned in the text.
Right, no left-wing or right-wing spin here.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly analytical. We want to understand the historical narrative, the cause and effect relationships, and the actual mechanics that transform a central bank from a simple printer of money into a guardian of global financial resilience.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're starting section 1 of our mental blueprint, core concept and title.
All right, let's hear the title.
The title for your infographic is The Evolution and Mechanics of Central Banking, from War Financing to Climate Risk and Systemic Resilience.
That covers a lot of ground.
It does. Now, I need a 2-sentence objective summary of this whole chapter. Hit me.
Okay, here is the summary. Central banks have undergone a radical transformation from special commercial entities designed to fund government war expenses into independent public sector guardians of macroeconomic and financial stability.
Okay, and sentence 2.
In the context of India, the Reserve Bank of India, or RBI, has evolved from a private shareholders bank in 1935 into a multifaceted regulator mandated to drive inclusive growth, maintain price stability, and ensure the resilience of the nation's payment and credit systems.
Okay, that is dense, but perfect for an exam, but let's bring it back to reality. There's a quote that kicks off this whole discussion in the source text.
Ah, the Will Rogers quote.
Yeah. It's from Will Rogers, the American humorist, and he makes this wild claim. He says there have been 3 great inventions since the beginning of time: fire, the wheel, and central banking.
It's a great quote.
But, I mean, come on. Fire and the wheel built human civilization as we know it. Central banking, it sets interest rates and regulates spreadsheets.
Yeah, right.
Is Rogers just being incredibly hyperbolic here?
Well, it absolutely sounds like hyperbole when you first hear it. But if you take a step back and look at the sheer scale of the modern economy, the comparison is actually profoundly accurate.
Really? How so?
Think of the modern global economy as an incredibly massive, complex internal combustion engine.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
It is running hot, it is constantly moving, generating immense power, right?
Yeah.
But also immense friction. Without a central bank, that engine has no cooling system, no shock absorbers, and no lubricant.
And without a cooling system, an engine that size just tears itself apart.
Precisely, and that's exactly what used to happen. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, before the mechanisms of central banking were fully realized, that economic engine would regularly overheat.
Like those panics we talked about.
Exactly. A local bank would make some bad loans, depositors would get spooked, they would rush to pull their money out.
And the bank collapses.
Right, and that panic would spread like a contagion to the next town and the next. Entire economies would routinely burn to the ground in the form of devastating financial panics.
Wow.
So Will Rogers was pointing out that a complex, interconnected economic civilization simply cannot survive its own volatility without this specific invention.
Okay, that paints a really vivid picture.
Uh,
It's not just about printing money. It's about engineering stability.
exactly.
All right, let's move to section 2 of our mental blueprint. Timeline and chronology. I want everyone listening to literally visualize a timeline. We are going to map out historical sequences chronologically.
Starting globally and then zooming into India, right?
Exactly. So global evolution, 1668.
1668. That is the year the Riksbank, the Swedish central bank, is set up.
The oldest central bank in the world.
It is.
But wait, if we go back to the very beginning, central banks weren't created to act as cooling systems or prevent panics, were they?
Not at all. That's the fascinating irony of central banking history. The institutions that today are tasked with stabilizing the global economy started out largely as mechanisms to finance wars.
War financing.
Mm.
So in 1668, we're talking about the era of empires and constant territorial conflicts in Europe.
Exactly. And waging war is incredibly expensive, you know? You need to pay soldiers, build ships, forge weapons. Monarchs constantly found themselves running out of gold and silver.
Right.
So they needed a way to manage sovereign debt and raise funds quickly. Which brings us to the next date on the timeline, 1694.
1694. The Bank of England is founded.
Under very similar circumstances to Sweden, the English government needed to rebuild its navy after a disastrous defeat by the French.
So the government basically says to the private sector, hey, we will give a group of private financiers a special charter if you lend us the money to build our ships.
That was the deal. And this is where we actually need to pull in a concept from Section 3 of our blueprint, key terminology.
Oh, right. Let's weed those definitions in.
These early institutions were established as banks of issue.
Banks of issue. Let me write that down. Bold text for the exam. What is the precise definition?
The initial designation for central banks, referring to their government-chartered monopoly privileges to issue notes or currency.
Wait, let me stop you there. So before this, anybody can just print their own money.
Essentially, yes. Various private commercial banks would print their own distinct paper banknotes.
That sounds like a mess.
It was chaotic. They were ostensibly backed by the gold or silver in their vaults, but imagine walking into a market and having to figure out if a note from the Bank of Newcastle was worth the same as a note from the Bank of London.
Oh, man. So by granting a monopoly to a single bank of issue,
the government centralized the currency. It made commerce infinitely smoother, and in exchange, the government got a massive line of credit to fight its wars.
it's amazing that the foundation of modern macroeconomic stability started as a naval defense procurement strategy.
It really is.
Okay, so we have these early central banks in the late 1600s acting as the government's personal piggy bank. But the timeline notes that the 18th and 19th centuries were marked by severe financial panics and bank runs.
They were brutal.
When do we transition from war piggy bank to the central bank acting as the cooling system? Because clearly the engine was overheating a lot back then.
To understand why they were so brutal, we have to look under the hood of how banking actually works. We need another key term here.
Maybe.
The text refers to it as maturity transformation or liquidity transformation.
Maturity transformation. Okay, bold that on the blueprint. Give me the exam-ready definition.
It is the banking practice of allocating society's resources by utilizing short-term and liquid liabilities like demand deposits, payable immediately to fund long-term and illiquid assets like loans that cannot be quickly converted to cash.
Okay, that is the perfect, dense academic definition. But translate that into English for me. What does that actually look like for me walking into a bank branch?
Think about your own checking account. You deposit your paycheck. To you, that money is available instantly. You can walk into the bank tomorrow and demand every single cent in cash.
Okay, so from the bank's perspective, my deposit is a liability.
Yes, they owe you that money. And it is a short-term liquid liability because you can demand it right now.
Right. But the bank isn't just taking my money and putting it in a cardboard box in the back room.
Mhm.
They have to make a profit,
Exactly. So the bank takes your short-term deposits, pools them together with thousands of others, and lends that money out to someone else who wants to buy a house.
creating a 30-year mortgage.
Yes. And to the bank, that mortgage is an asset because it generates interest income over time.
Oh,
But it is a long-term illiquid asset. They cannot easily or quickly convert that physical house back into cash.
So they are constantly performing this high-wire balancing act. They were taking money that can vanish today and locking it up in assets that won't fully return for 30 years.
That is maturity transformation. They're transforming the short-term maturity of your deposit into the long-term maturity of a loan.
It's a brilliant system, honestly. It allows society to build homes and fund businesses.
It is, but as you said, it is a high-wire act, and the wind can blow very hard, which leads to Section 6 of our blueprint, cause and effect relationships.
Okay, let's map it out. Cause. Bank balance sheets are structured with short-term liquid liabilities and long-term illiquid assets.
Effect. Banks are highly susceptible to panics or self-fulfilling runs.
And the classic run on a bank. How does that happen mechanically?
Let's say there is a rumor, maybe true, maybe completely false, that the bank made a few bad loans and is running out of cash. You hear this rumor, your neighbor hears it, human psychology takes over.
Panic sets in.
Everyone runs to the bank at the exact same time to withdraw their short-term demand deposits.
And the bank literally does not have the physical cash in the vault because it is locked up in my neighbor's 30-year mortgage.
Right. The bank might actually be perfectly solvent on paper. Their assets, the mortgages, might be perfectly fine and worth millions.
But they are illiquid in reality.
Exactly. They can't pay out the cash today, so the bank fails. Wow.
It collapses not because its underlying business was bad, but because of a self-fulfilling panic based on a temporary lack of liquidity.
That is terrifying when you realize that our entire economic system relies on the assumption that we won't all ask for our money at the same time.
It's entirely built on mass psychology and trust.
And in the 18th and 19th centuries, that trust broke down constantly.
Because there was no backstop. If a bank ran out of cash, it was just dead. And when one bank died, people naturally assumed the bank across the street was next.
So they ran on that one too. Contagion.
Pure contagion.
Which brings us to the next date on our timeline, and a major figure for Section 4 of our blueprint. Important figures and names. The year is 1873, and the name is Walter Bagehot.
Yes, Walter Bagehot.
Who is he, and how does he solve this contagion problem?
He was an incredibly influential thinker and the editor of The Economist magazine. In 1873, he published a book titled Lombard Street, which was a study of the London money market.
In this book, he articulated a framework that fundamentally changed central banking forever. It became known as Bagehot's dictum, or the doctrine of the lender of last resort.
Let's define that for Section 3. Lender of last resort.
The central banks function in periods of panic or crisis to lend freely to banks against quality collateral at a penal rate of interest.
And this is the consequence in our cause and effect chain, right?
Exactly. Cause. Bank balance sheets cause susceptibility to panics. Effect. Banks are susceptible to runs. Consequence. Central banks must act as a lender of last resort to prevent solvent banks from resorting to fire sales of assets at deep discounts, averting broader crises.
So Bagehot actually wrote the specific instruction manual for this. Let's unpack those 3 rules you just mentioned in the definition because they seem very carefully engineered. First, lend freely.
Right. The central bank has the unique power to create money. So Bagehot said, when the public panics and wants cash, the central bank must provide an unlimited supply of cash to the commercial banks.
Just open the floodgates.
Exactly. When the public sees that the bank actually has the cash to pay everyone, the psychology flips. The panic subsides. If you know you can get your money, you suddenly don't need to get your money.
It's a Jedi mind trick.
It really is.
But the second rule is against good quality collateral. So the central bank isn't just handing out free money to anyone.
Definitely not. Remember, maturity transformation. The commercial bank has those 30-year mortgages. Good, solid assets, but illiquid. Under Bagehot's rule, the commercial bank takes those good assets, hands them over to the central bank as collateral.
And the central bank gives them the short-term cash they need to survive the run.
This ensures the central bank isn't bailing out banks that are actually bankrupt. They are only providing liquidity to banks that are fundamentally solvent.
Brilliant. And what about that third rule? At a penal rate of interest. Why charge a penalty rate during a crisis? Shouldn't you make the loans cheap to help them out?
This is the genius of Bagehot. If you make the emergency loans cheap, you create what economists call moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
Commercial banks would take on crazy, reckless risks, knowing that if things went wrong, the central bank would just bail them out with cheap money. By charging a high penal rate of interest, Bagehot ensured that banks would only come to the central bank as a true last resort when they were absolutely desperate.
Ah, so it punishes the bank for getting into a liquidity crisis, but it saves the broader economy from collapse.
Precise.
Lend freely against good collateral at a penal rate. It is a beautifully elegant mechanical solution. So Bagehot writes this in 1873. Does the whole world immediately adopt this model and set up central banks?
Surprisingly, no. And this brings us to Section 5 of our blueprint, Vital Statistics and Empirical Data.
Hit me with a stat.
18.
18.
That is the total number of central banks existing globally at the turn of the 20th century, just 18.
That is wild. I mean, there are nearly 200 countries in the world today, almost all with central banks. Why was it still such a rare institutional model around the year 1900?
Because the ideological battle was still raging. Many nations, particularly newly industrialized ones, were deeply suspicious of centralizing that much financial power in one institution. They feared it would lead to government overreach.
Which brings us to the United States on our timeline. The text explicitly points out that the U.S. was a relatively late entrant to the central banking arena.
Very late.
They didn't establish the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the U.S., until 1914. Given the massive financial dominance of the U.S. today, it seems crazy that they were centuries behind Sweden and England.
It was a fiercely debated issue in American history. The U.S. actually had two early attempts at a central bank in the 18th and 19th centuries, but their charters were allowed to expire due to intense political opposition.
For people who distrusted concentrated financial power.
Exactly. So for most of the 1800s and early 1900s, the U.S. operated without a central bank.
And how does that work out for them?
It was incredibly volatile. The U.S. economy suffered through severe recurring financial panics in 1873, 1893, and particularly the Panic of 1907.
What happened in 1907?
The banking system almost completely collapsed, and it was only saved because J.P. Morgan, the private banker, locked all the top financiers in his personal library and essentially forced them to act collectively as a pseudo-central bank.
Wait, he just locked them in a room?
Yep, pooling their money to rescue failing trusts.
So they literally had a single wealthy guy acting as the central bank. That doesn't seem like a sustainable macroeconomic policy.
It wasn't. The 1907 panic finally convinced the U.S. political establishment that a modern industrial economy could not rely on the ad hoc charity of Wall Street titans.
The volatility was just too destructive.
That realization led directly to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1914.
So crises force evolution. The Panic of 1907 forces the U.S. to finally build a central bank.
Exactly.
Let's move our timeline forward to the 1930s, the Great Depression. How does this reshape the central banking landscape?
The 1930s mark a profound philosophical shift. Prior to the Great Depression, many central banks were primarily focused on maintaining the gold standard.
Meaning ensuring their paper currency could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold.
Right, and keeping inflation in check. But the sheer devastation of the 1930s proved that focusing narrowly on currency valuation wasn't enough.
Because during the Depression, you had massive systemic bank failures. Thousands of banks just vanished, taking people's life savings with them.
And the central banks, tied down by the rigid rules of the gold standard, often failed to act as aggressive lenders of last resort.
They didn't follow Bagehot's rules.
They didn't. They let the banks fail, which contracted the money supply, which led to a catastrophic deflationary spiral and massive unemployment.
So what was the lesson learned?
The global focus of central banks had to shift prominently toward maintaining financial stability.
Let's pause and define terms here for Section 3, because the text makes a very specific distinction between macroeconomic stability and financial stability. What is the difference?
It is a crucial distinction. Macroeconomic stability refers to the dual objective of achieving stable and sustainable economic growth while keeping prices stable, meaning low and stable inflation.
Okay, so that's GDP growth and the cost of groceries.
Yeah.
What is financial stability?
Financial stability is the objective of keeping the financial system resilient and avoiding financial crises.
Ah, I see.
It is about the plumbing of the system itself, ensuring that banks are well capitalized, that payment systems function.
So you could theoretically have a situation where macroeconomic indicators look great, GDP is growing, Inflation is low, but financial stability is secretly rotting from the inside.
Precisely. You could have an economy that looks perfectly healthy on the surface,
Yeah.
but underneath, commercial banks are taking on insane amounts of leverage and making terrible loans.
And if that plumbing bursts, it doesn't matter how good your GDP looked yesterday, you are in a crisis today.
The 1930s taught central banks that they have to actively monitor and regulate the plumbing, not just the temperature.
Okay, so we've evolved from war financing to managing localized bank runs with batch hot to realizing we need to manage systemic financial stability after the Depression. Let's fast forward our timeline a few decades to another massive evolutionary trigger, 1974.
1974 is a huge year.
The text highlights the failure of two specific banks in that year, Franklin National Bank in the United States and Bankhurstadt in Germany. Let's add them to our important figure section. Why are these two specific failures so critical?
1974 is the year regulators realized that financial contagion no longer respected national borders. By the 1970s, banking had become highly internationalized.
Banks were trading massive amounts of foreign currencies across different time zones. Let's map out the cause and effect for this one. Cause. The internationalization of commercial banking activity led to the failure of two major cross-border banks in 1974.
Effect. The realization that financial contagion ignores national borders.
So what actually happened with Bankhurstadt to cause that realization?
It is a fascinating story of timing. Bankhurstadt was a German bank that had made some disastrous bets in the foreign exchange markets and became insolvent.
Okay.
The German regulators stepped in and ordered the bank to be liquidated. But here is the critical detail. They ordered it closed at the end of the German business day, which was 3:30 p.m. in Frankfurt.
Oh, wait. 3:30 p.m. in Frankfurt is morning in New York.
Exactly. It's 10:30 a.m. in New York. Earlier that day, Herstatt had entered into foreign exchange trades with American banks. The American banks had already delivered German marks to Herstatt during the European trading hours.
And in exchange, Herstatt was supposed to deliver U.S. dollars to the American banks later in the day, during New York trading hours.
Yes. But when the German regulators shut Herstatt down at 3:30 p.m. their time, the bank ceased to exist.
Oh, no.
It never sent the U.S. dollars it owed to the American banks in New York. The American banks had paid out millions and received absolutely nothing in return.
That is a massive blind spot. The regulators only looked at their own time zone.
The effect was instant global panic. The international interbank market completely froze. Banks stopped trusting each other, regardless of where they were located.
Because they realized that a local regulatory action in Europe could instantly blow a hole in a balance sheet in Manhattan.
It proved that in a globalized world, a localized crisis is a global crisis.
So what was the consequence in our cause and effect chain?
The establishment of the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, the BCBS.
Add that to important figures and names. The BCBS. We hear about Basel standards all the time. What exactly do they do?
Established to set international regulatory standards, Basel standards acting as the bedrock for national and international banking regulation.
So they write the international rules of the game.
Yes, they dictate things like capital adequacy ratios, telling banks exactly how much safe cash they need to hold in reserve as a shock absorber.
To ensure a Herstatt-style failure doesn't ripple across the globe. It's like building global fire codes for the economic engine. Now, while all of this global evolution is happening, from Batch Hot in London to Herstatt in Germany, there is an entirely distinct parallel evolution happening in India.
Yes, we need to shift our timeline to the evolution of the Reserve Bank of India.
Right. So where does their story begin on our timeline?
The structural origin begins in 1926.
1926.
With a group called the Royal Commission on Indian Currency and Finance.
Also known as the Hilton Young Commission, right? Add them to important figures. What was their specific mandate?
At the time, India was under British colonial rule and the monetary system was bifurcated. The government controlled the issuance of currency, while a separate entity managed credit and banking functions.
The Imperial Bank of India.
Right. The system was clunky and prone to instability, so the Hilton Young Commission officially recommended that these two functions, the control of currency and the control of credit, needed to be unified under a single independent central bank.
I want to pause and really think about this recommendation, because it feels like a massive sliding doors moment for modern India.
It really is.
What if the Hilton Young Commission hadn't made that recommendation? What if they had said, you know what, let's just let the government department keep direct control of printing the currency? How different would the Indian economy look today?
It is a profound counterfactual. The separation of money creation from immediate political imperatives is arguably the absolute cornerstone of modern macroeconomic stability.
Because if politicians retain the direct power to just print money whenever they want, the temptation is virtually irresistible.
Right. Think about it. If you are a politician facing a tough election and you want to build a new highway or fund a massive social program, but you don't want to raise taxes and anger the voters.
If you own the printing press, you just print the money.
Exactly. And the inevitable result of printing unbacked money to fund government deficits is massive inflation. The purchasing power of the currency collapses.
We have seen this play out in numerous countries throughout the 20th century.
Hyperinflationary spirals that devastate the middle and lower classes.
So by recommending an independent central bank, the Hilton-Young Commission laid the groundwork for an institution that could say no to the immediate political desires of the government.
To protect the long-term purchasing power of the currency, yes.
It takes the keys to the liquor cabinet away from the politicians. Okay, so the recommendation is made in 1926. Next date on the timeline, 1934.
1934. The Reserve Bank of India Act is passed. This lays the statutory legal groundwork.
And then 1935.
1935, the RBI officially starts operations.
But importantly, the text notes that when it starts in 1935, it isn't a government entity. It starts as a private shareholders bank.
Yes, similar to the original Bank of England, it was initially structured with private capital, though its mandate was always public service.
Okay, next date, 1939. World War II begins. And war, as we established back in 1668, changes everything about central banking.
Absolutely. The British Empire needed to heavily manage its resources, including its foreign exchange reserves, for the war effort.
So under the Defense of India rules in 1939, the RBI began strictly regulating foreign exchange transactions.
They couldn't allow vital foreign currency to leave the country for non-essential imports.
This sounds like the beginning of a very tightly controlled economy.
It was, and this control only tightened after Indian independence. Our next date is 1947.
1947, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, or FARA, is passed.
FARA solidified a regime of strict, almost draconian control over external payments and capital.
Because foreign exchange was viewed as an incredibly scarce, sovereign resource that had to be heavily guarded.
Exactly. The overarching philosophy of the era was conservation.
Okay, moving down the timeline. 1949 is a huge year. Two major things happen.
First, the RBI is nationalized. It formally transitions from a private shareholders bank to a fully public, state-owned institution.
And the second thing.
The Banking Regulation Act is passed. This is a critical piece of legislation because it gives the RBI sweeping, explicit powers to design and implement regulatory policy.
To conduct inspections, supervise all commercial banks.
It officially anoints the RBI as the supreme commander of the Indian banking system.
Okay, so from 1949 onwards, you have a powerful nationalized RBI overseeing a banking system in an economy that is highly insulated from the rest of the world due to laws like FARA. It's a closed loop.
But a closed loop can't last forever.
Which brings us to arguably the most important cause and effect relationship in modern Indian economic history. The year 1991. What happened?
1991 was an existential macroeconomic crisis for India. It was a severe balance of payment and foreign exchange crisis.
Let's define balance of payment crisis. What does that mean in real terms?
It means the country was literally running out of the foreign currency required to pay for its essential imports. India relies heavily on importing oil to fuel its economy, and oil must be paid for in US dollars.
Okay.
By the summer of 1991, India's foreign exchange reserves had dwindled so low that they only had enough dollars to finance roughly 3 weeks' worth of imports.
3 weeks? That is terrifying. If the oil stops flowing, the entire economy grinds to a halt, the trucks stop moving, the power plants shut down. What was the cause?
It was the culmination of years of heavy fiscal deficits, high inflation, and the structural rigidities of that closed, heavily regulated economy we just talked about.
So cause. The 1991 balance of payment and foreign exchange prices in India. Effect. The RBI has to play an immediate, desperate role in helping the government manage the crisis.
Right. But the true consequence of the 1991 crisis was a total paradigm shift in how the Indian economy operated.
What kind of shift?
A paradigm shift towards liberalization, privatization, and globalization. They opened up the economy to foreign investment, dismantled the stifling license regimes, and began integrating with the global market.
And how did this change the DNA of the RBI? Because if the whole economy shifts, The central bank has to shift with it.
Dramatically. And to understand this shift, let's open up Section 7 of our blueprint, the comparative matrix.
All right, everyone drawing a mental table right now.
Let's look at Category 4 in that matrix, RBI's foreign exchange rule. Let's compare pre-1991 and post-1991.
Okay, pre-1991 is the FARA era.
Right, foreign exchange regulation, focused on conservation and sovereign allocation of scarce foreign exchange.
Guarding the borders. And post-1991.
Post-1991 is the FEMA era. Notice the subtle change, foreign exchange management.
From regulation to management.
Focused on liberalization and global integration. The RBI moved from being a strict border guard to becoming a sophisticated traffic controller, actively developing a vibrant, liquid foreign exchange market.
That is a phenomenal conceptual shift. Let's actually fill out the rest of this comparative matrix while we are here. Category 1. Primary central bank objectives, early history versus modern era.
Early history, providing finance to the government to meet war expenses, managing debt, and functioning as a bank of issue.
War piggy banks.
Yeah.
And modern era.
Maintaining macroeconomic stability, financial stability, promoting inclusive growth, and managing cross-border and climate risks.
Huge expansion. Okay, category 2, monetary policy versus financial stability tools.
Monetary policy tools involve varying short-term interest rates to control money supply and demand, encouraging or discouraging consumption and investment.
That's the accelerator pedal. And financial stability tools.
Provision of liquidity-like lender, of last resort regulation, and supervision, creating prudent rules for a healthy banking system.
Okay, we've got one more category for the matrix, but we'll save it for fintech in a minute. Because right now, I want to jump back to our timeline.
So good.
We just talked about how 1991 forced the RBI to evolve. And earlier I asked if central banks were just inherently reactive institutions, because it seems like every major evolution, the Fed in 1914, Basel in 1974, the Indian reforms in 1991, only happens after a catastrophe.
It is a very astute observation, and the text strongly implies that central banking is, by its very nature, an evolutionary craft, not a static, perfected science.
Because the financial system is organic and constantly innovating.
Exactly. Private markets are always creating new types of credit, new cross-border linkages, new financial instruments. Risks often build up quietly in the blind spots.
And regulators can only regulate what they can see.
Right. A crisis is simply a harsh light that illuminates the blind spots. Evolution in central banking is almost always forged in the fire of a crisis.
Which is the perfect segue to the mother of all modern crises on our timeline, 2007 to 2008, the global financial crisis, the GFC.
The GFC fundamentally rewrote the monetary policy playbook.
If the previous crises forced central banks to evolve their regulatory frameworks, the 2008 crisis forced them to completely invent new weapons to fight the fire.
Yes, the crisis was so severe, so deeply embedded in complex housing and derivative markets, that the traditional tools of central banking completely failed.
Let's map the cause and effect. Cause. The 2007-08 global financial crisis rendered traditional monetary tools ineffective and markets dysfunctional.
Effect. Central banks strengthened their toolboxes with unconventional policies.
Let's grab that term for Section 3, unconventional policies. What is the definition?
Extraordinary central bank measures introduced post-2007-08, including quantitative or credit easing, negative interest rates, and forward guidance.
Okay, people hear these buzzwords all the time. Let's break down how they actually work mechanically. What is quantitative easing, or QE?
Quantitative easing is an extraordinary measure where the central bank steps in and actively purchases massive amounts of long-term securities, like government bonds or mortgage-backed securities, directly from the open market.
Wait, where do they get the money to buy billions of dollars worth of bonds?
They create it electronically. They credit the accounts of the financial institutions selling the bonds.
So they're literally just injecting massive amounts of new digital cash directly into the veins of the financial system.
Yes. By buying these bonds, they drive up the price of the bonds, which conversely drives down long-term interest rates.
Because remember, during the GFC, they had already slashed short-term interest rates all the way down to zero. They hit the zero lower bound.
Exactly. The traditional tool was exhausted. So QE is a way to force long-term borrowing costs down, making it cheaper for corporations to finance long-term debt and stimulating investment when traditional rate cuts fail.
Brute forcing liquidity into the system. Got it. What about another unconventional term from the text? Forward guidance. That sounds less like a financial mechanism and more like corporate PR.
It is essentially the ultimate Jedi mind trick of central banking.
Another Jedi mind trick.
Forward guidance is when the central bank explicitly communicates its future intentions regarding monetary policy to the public and the markets.
So they just tell everyone what they're going to do next year. How does that help today?
Let's say interest rates are at 0 today. A business might think, I should borrow money to build a factory, but what if the central bank raises rates in 6 months and my loan gets too expensive?
That uncertainty freezes investment.
Right. With forward guidance, the central bank publicly commits. We promise we will keep interest rates at exactly 0 for the next 3 years or until unemployment drops below a specific target.
By removing the uncertainty of the future, they alter behavior in the present.
Exactly. If the business knows rates will stay at 0 for 3 years, they build the factory today. It's a way of stimulating the economy using nothing but credibility and communication.
And during this 2008 crisis, the text says central banks had to assume a new role. This is the consequence in our cause and effect chain. They became market makers of last resort. Add that to terminology.
Market makers of last resort. The role assumed by central banks during the 2007-08 crisis when traditional markets became completely dysfunctional.
We talked about Bagehot's lender of last resort from 1873. What is the distinction here?
A lender of last resort deals directly with individual banks. The bank comes to the discount window, hands over collateral, and gets a loan.
Okay.
But in 2008, entire markets seized up. For example, the market for commercial paper, the short-term debt that major corporations use to make daily payroll, completely froze. No private buyers were willing to step in.
The market just stopped existing.
Right. Normally, private financial institutions act as market makers. They stand ready to buy and sell securities to keep liquidity flowing. In 2008, the private market makers fled.
So the central banks had to step in.
They bypassed the banks entirely and started buying commercial paper directly to ensure that large corporations could still make payroll and didn't instantly go bankrupt.
An unprecedented expansion of their footprint. Which brings us to the most recent stress test on our timeline, a crisis that was entirely different from 2008, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes. 2008 was a financial crisis that spilled over into the real economy. COVID-19 was a public health crisis, a sudden massive shock originating in the non-financial sector.
It threatened to annihilate the global economy through sheer abrupt paralysis. Lockdowns meant businesses instantly lost all revenue, but their fixed costs remained.
So the cause is the sudden non-financial sector stress of the pandemic.
What was the effect? How did central banks, particularly the RBI, respond compared to 2008?
The effect was swift sovereign fiscal policy, paired with central bank policy easing, regulatory forbearance, and targeted liquidity measures.
Regulatory forbearance, meaning they temporarily relax the rules on classifying bad loans to give borrowers breathing room.
Exactly. And highly targeted liquidity measures designed to keep credit flowing to the most vulnerable sectors.
And we can see the mathematical footprint of this intervention in our vital statistics section. Let's look at the numbers. The text highlights 28.6%. What does that number represent?
28.6% represents the peak size of the Reserve Bank's balance sheet as a percentage of India's total GDP in the financial year 2020-21.
Is 28.6% a lot? Give me the context.
It is a massive expansion. Just the year prior, in 2019-20, it was at 24.6%. That jump represents an enormous injection of liquidity.
Because when they do QE and buy bonds, those assets go onto their balance sheet.
Right. So a rapidly expanding balance sheet as a percentage of GDP is the clearest empirical evidence that the central bank is acting aggressively to flood the engine with lubricant.
To prevent it from seizing up during a shock. And the consequence of that massive, tailored intervention was a faster economic recovery. But there is no free lunch in economics.
No, there isn't.
What was the secondary consequence?
The secondary consequence was that this massive injection of liquidity unexpectedly unleashed a wave of intense global inflation. The central banks pumped in the money to prevent a depression, but then they had to pivot incredibly quickly to fight the resulting inflation.
We should note a stat from the text here implicitly related to inflation, 4%.
Yes, 4%. The text implicitly mentions this as the target limit when discussing the bounds of the RBI's objectives for low and stable expectations of inflation.
Okay, so the inflation hits, and this is where the data gets really interesting regarding the RBI's exit strategy compared to the rest of the world.
Right.
The text notes another stat. 26.7% and 22.5%. The moderated size of the RBI's balance sheet as a percent of GDP in 2021-22 and 2022-23, respectively.
So it came back down.
And the text explicitly looks at a metric called M3. Let's define M3 for Section 3.
Broad money, or M3. The sum of currency with the public, demand and time deposits with banks, and other deposits with the Reserve Bank.
The total pool of purchasing power out there. So if you flood the system during COVID, M3 spikes.
Naturally.
And the text compares India's M3 to GDP ratio versus major advanced economies like the US, the UK, and the Euro area.
Yeah.
What did that data show?
It showed a significant divergence. India witnessed a much faster normalization of its COVID-19-induced monetary stimulus. The M3 to nominal GDP ratio in India reverted back to its pre-pandemic steady levels much quicker than in those advanced economies.
Why? Did the RBI just panic and pull the plug early?
No, it was by design. Many of the RBI's pandemic liquidity measures were designed with inbuilt terminal dates. They were explicit temporary facilities. When the expiration date hit, the facility closed, and the liquidity began to drain naturally from the system. This allowed for a much cleaner, more structured exit strategy.
It's like administering a powerful medicine, but putting a strict timer on the IV drip so the patient doesn't overdose.
Exactly.
Okay, we have tracked this evolution from 17th century war financing to 21st century pandemic liquidity management. But the text doesn't stop at the present day. It looks ahead to the emerging threats.
The next wave of evolution.
There are two big ones, fintech and climate change. Let's tackle fintech first. Open back up Section 7, our comparative matrix.
Category 3, fintech regulatory approaches.
The text contrasts two approaches, activity-based versus entity-based regulation. Add those to terminology.
This is currently one of the fiercest debates in financial regulation. Historically, regulation has largely been entity-based. You regulate the bank as an institution.
But with the rise of fintech, you have all sorts of non-bank startups offering financial services.
Right, so an activity-based framework argues for applying uniform rules to similar actions. Same activity, same risk, same regulation.
So if a tech startup issues a loan, they should follow the exact same lending rules as a traditional commercial bank, regardless of what kind of corporate entity they are.
It seems incredibly fair on the surface.
It does seem fair. If Apple decides to offer a credit card, shouldn't they just follow the same consumer protection rules as my local credit union? Why wouldn't activity-based regulation be enough?
And that is exactly where the text pivots. Activity-based rules are fine for a small lending app, but when you are dealing with big tech companies like Apple, Amazon, or Google entering the financial space,
The text notes that activity-based regulation is potentially less effective.
even dangerous, because a massive tech conglomerate is not just issuing a loan, they possess overwhelming structural advantages. Massive closed-loop ecosystems, billions of captive users, and unprecedented troves of behavioral data. If a big tech firm's financial arm fails, the systemic risk isn't just about the bad loans, it's about the entanglement of their financial services with their critical cloud infrastructure, their e-commerce platform.
A local credit union failing doesn't take down the internet.
Precisely. Therefore, for big tech, regulators are realizing they need entity-based regulation, adapting the regulation to the specific nature of the firm.
Looking holistically at the systemic risks posed by the entire massive corporate entity.
Exactly.
It's acknowledging that an elephant and a mouse shouldn't have the same weight restrictions just because they both happen to be walking on the same bridge.
That is a perfect analogy. The systemic footprint is entirely different.
Okay, that brings us to the final major cause and effect relationship outlined in the blueprint. And honestly, it's one that some people might find surprising to see in a central banking text. Climate change.
Yes.
Why is an institution designed to manage interest rates and supervise banks concerning itself with global warming?
It all comes back to the mandate of financial stability. Climate change poses threats to long-term growth, monetary stability, and the safety of regulated entities.
How so? Walk me through the mechanics of a climate risk becoming a financial crisis.
There are two main channels: physical risks and transition risks. Physical risks are straightforward. Increased severity of hurricanes, floods, or wildfires can physically destroy the assets that banks hold as collateral.
So if a bank holds thousands of mortgages in a coastal city that becomes uninsurable due to rising sea levels.
Those assets become worthless, and the bank's balance sheet collapses.
And the second channel, transition risks.
Transition risks occur as society shifts toward a lower carbon economy. Governments might suddenly pass aggressive carbon taxes or ban certain types of fossil fuels.
Right.
If a bank has aggressively lent billions to a coal company and new legislation suddenly makes coal economically unviable, the coal company defaults, and the bank is left holding stranded assets.
So, cause. Climate change poses threats to long-term growth and safety. Effect. Since central banks are statutorily mandated to maintain financial stability, they must address climate risks.
They literally have no choice. It is fundamentally a core part of their job description.
Which leads to the final consequence and the final date on our global timeline, July 2021.
July 2021. The Financial Stability Board, the FSB, endorsed a coordinated global roadmap for addressing climate-related financial risks.
Pushing for mandatory firm-level disclosures, better data modeling, and integrating climate risk directly into banking supervisory practices.
Making the invisible risks visible to the market.
Wow. Okay, let's take a breath and look at the mental blueprint we have just constructed. We have mapped the entire overarching narrative.
We started with the core concept, the evolution from war financing to guardians of macroeconomic and financial stability.
We trace the timelines from the 1668 Riksbank to the 2021 FSB Climate Roadmap, and from the 1926 Hilton Young Commission to the 1991 Indian Liberalization.
We unpacked dense mechanics like maturity transformation, quantitative easing, and entity-based regulation.
And we mapped the cause and effect chains that show how every major leap in central banking was essentially forged in the fire of a crisis.
If you understand the structural logic we have walked through today, if you can trace the line from Bagehot's dictum to the 2008 market maker interventions, you have a profound professional understanding of the invisible architecture of the global economy.
You don't just know the dates, you know the mechanics, which means you absolutely do not need to subject yourself to rereading that textbook chapter.
Definitely not.
But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final thought, a thread to pull on as you think about the future. We've seen that the central bank's mandate just keeps expanding, from funding navies to stopping bank runs to managing inflation to confronting big tech and climate change.
The evolution never stops.
Right. So what is the next frontier? As we look at the rapid rise of central bank digital currencies, where the central bank bypasses commercial banks entirely and issues digital money directly to citizens, and the implementation of artificial intelligence in complex financial modeling, what happens to the human element?
That is the existential question for the next decade.
Will the precision of AI algorithms ultimately replace the inherently subjective craft of a central bank committee sitting in a room arguing about interest rates? Or, because money at its very core is just a shared illusion based entirely on human trust, will we always need a distinctly human institution to step in and say, we will lend freely, when the math breaks down and the primal panic sets in?
Does the cold logic of an algorithm stop a bank run, or do you need a Walter Bagehot?
It is the ultimate tension between perfect economic engineering and messy human psychology. It is going to be fascinating to watch unfold. Something to mull over the next time you tap your card and it magically approves your coffee.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the blueprint. Review the mechanics, trust your understanding of the structure, and go crush that exam or meeting. You've got this.